Greetings, friends! Wanningerski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of June 9th through June 15th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, share this video around, and just continue being awesome, my dudes. Okay, sweet. So this week in the Russian-Ukraine War, we have a huge update. In the sense that the South Donetsk direction is now crumbling before our very eyes. We talked about last week how the battle for Komar, which is one of the main centers of Ukrainian resistance in the South Donetsk direction after the fall of Krakova and Velika Novosovka. Well, I thought like, they reached the southern part, but it's going to take maybe a few weeks for them to clear it. They just finished clearing Komar. The Russians have raised their flags in various areas of Komar, and the Ukrainians retreated on the other side of this river here. And it looks like, as you can see, there's a river here, the Volchka River and the Moltka Yara River, and they kind of intersect here. But they go something like this. And so, from the reports, it looks like the Ukrainians are slowly falling back to the other side of this river here, just so they could get extra protection from the Russians. And so, it looks like, with Komar being on the other side of this river, they stood no chance. I thought they would hold on a bit more because, at least they have, maybe some sort of, the Russians did encircle them from the west here, so they could still supply Komar, but it looks like the Ukrainians just couldn't hold on, and Komar has fallen. This is a very big gain for the Russians. Now the Russians could accumulate forces in Komar. And this would give them a more forward operating base than, say, Velika Novosovka, which is now all the way in the south here. Because now, as they push northwards, there was not really a big, a bigger town they could accumulate forces in. And Komar will give them enough forces to be able to do their main objective, which is to take the rest of South Donetsk, which is, I'll show it to you guys here. It's actually conveniently along a river, which will give them a natural defense. So this is the rest of the South Donetsk. So Komar is the linchpin for taking the rest of everything up to this red line here. So this also helps the Russians take Novopoltovka, which is, I think, another goal for the Russians in this area as well. But it kind of is intersection with the Pokrovsk direction. But anyway, the battle for Komar has ended. It was a very quick battle. Last week we talked about how the Russians were basically just in this southern part. Earlier in the week, we saw the Russians start entering the center part, but I thought, okay, the centers where, the more bigger buildings are, the Ukrainians are going to put up a big fight. No, the Russians, they just got clobbered. All of Komar got taken. Along with this, the Russians are making rapid progress across these fields all the way up to the villages of Zaporizhzhia, Yalta, and Zerka. In fact, some sources are saying they have just reached the outskirts of the village of Zaporizhzhia, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of next week, everything behind these rivers is taken by the Russians. So this would be a very big gain for the Russians, and this would allow the Russians, which are advancing from this area, to also take the village of Dachny, which will give the Russians another foothold in the Dnipro Oblast as they move along the river to try to reach Novopoltovka. But yeah, the amount of progress we're seeing here is extraordinary. We're talking this amount of land getting taken. That's a huge amount. Right now it's just it's fields, but it's a very big gain for the Russians. Usually as we saw before, usually takes one tree line at a time to advance, but with the advancements here, the Russians are making very big progress to liberate the rest of South Donetsk. Now, another area where the Russians are making very much rapid progress is kind of in this area near Yunakivka. The Russians were stuck here for the last few months, even though they took Baratar and everything. They were stuck on the outskirts here, and we talked about how the Russians entered this village last week as well. But just like last week, apparently I need to put a shout out here to the 114th Brigade of the Russian Federation here, because they are making a bunch of they were the ones who liberated a bunch of these villages from. If you remember during the Krakova offensive, they're the ones who took Ukrainsk, basically everything in this area here, and actually Andriivka too. So they took everything up north here. So everything I think in this area was taken by the 114th Brigade. As we saw in the fall, they were the ones raising their flags in all these areas here. They weren't alone, but they were kind of the main assault force. And it looks like they got taken out during the wintertime and springtime for refitting. It looks like they are back, and they just got introduced, and they basically broke the Ukrainian defenses here. And so the Russians have completely captured the village of Yunakivka here. This was a major prize. But not only that, they managed to do a big offensive push, and we actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians reaching right on the outskirts of the Dnipro Oblast here, and they have taken the villages of Zelenki Kut and Novoukrayinka. Along with this, while we don't have exact geolocations on this, but I'm pretty certain this is very much in tandem with what would happen here is that the Russian, according to a lot of mappers, is that the Russians have also taken all the trench networks that are north here. These are actually what were preventing the Russians from taking these villages for so long, because the Ukrainians built a bunch of trenches here, just like they built a bunch of trenches to the north of Andriivka and everything here. That kind of complicated the offensive. The offensive in these, like this town and these two villages, were held up by a bunch of trenches here, and looks like the Russians have taken these trenches as well. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, clear up, the fields between their positions up north here and here, just to clear up the rest of these fields in the Donetsk Oblast, and then start advancing into the Dnieper Oblast as well. So lots of progress in the South Donetsk direction. More in this area, there's been no changes, but a lot of progress here, and I am interested. The big question now is what the Russians will do once they, take everything to the other side of the Molka Yar River. Will they cross it? Technically the Russians already have a position on the other side in the south here, but obviously they've been stuck here a little bit. They took Fyodorovka, but, the Russians have not been able to break through the defenses in Shintaevko, and everything like that. So, the Russians were supposed to keep moving kind of north here until they reached the Vochka River here. But it seems like the Ukrainian defenses in this area have been holding them out. So I don't know if the Russians are going to cross the river here and try to assault, maybe take the village of Grishka, Tolstoya, and try to make a bridgehead here so that then they could just advance along this river, and then maybe then advance southwards, and then use Komar to maybe cross the river here. The river gives them a defensive, but it's not exactly like a huge river. It's not like the Oskil River or the Dnieper River. It can be crossed in certain places, especially with some pontoon bridges. And so definitely, they could maybe make a bridgehead here, and then maybe link up with the forces that are up here. So, that might be what the Russians do. But it would be interesting to see how the Russians will do to try to clear up the rest of the South Donetsk Oblast here. And then let's go to the Zaporizhzhia direction, because there's actually been some very interesting changes in the Zaporizhzhia direction as well. We talked about how the Russians looked like they started an offensive in the eastern part of Giliapolia, and it looks like we actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being right on the southern part of Malinovka. This area and these kind of warehouses in the south here. There's a few, obviously, the Russians still, this is a pretty decent sized village, especially with where the Russians don't really have much. I think they're probably accumulating in the village of Novozolopilia here, but there's not a big town. Maybe if you have to go down all the way to Polony, kind of a lot further down actually, to find a very big town to accumulate. So it's the Russians have to go through a bunch of forests here. And open fields, which is hard. And Malinovka, I think, is a very good staging ground if the Russians are going to take it to start encircling Giliapolia from the east, because I think I mentioned this last week, but I think if once the Russians take the rest of South Donetsk, I think one of the main things they're going to do now is try to move kind of southwest here towards the village of Uspenovka and towards the village of Dolinovka, just to cut off one of the main highways that supports Giliapolia, and then just kind of push, down this way, and then also, they move from here, and then they could then, push up to here, and then maybe there might be a small offensive here to cut this road, and then just do a battle for Giliapolia, which is one of the main Ukrainian defenses in Zaporizhzhia. So it looks like the Russians are right now putting more pressure. This could just be a pressure point to hog down the Ukrainians here to prevent them from moving reinforcements, but it might be maybe a future a shaping operation for a future offensive in Giliapolia. But I do think that once the Russians take Malinovka, which I think is what the Russians will try to do, is that then the Russians will probably use Malinovka as a base to then move a little bit across this road, take the villages of Visola, Zelenahai, and Visovka, just to protect their flank a little bit here. And then I do think the Russians will then try to take battle for the village of Poltavka. And then you kind of use these fields on the other side of this river, I think the Yanchur River, and they could use this as a defense, and maybe, and there's also this little Rada reservoir here, and so the Russians could maybe move across from the village of Novodarivka and Ladinovka and Sapova and try to take everything right here. Take this thing, and then they could also, once they take Malinovka, they could take Poltavka as well here. And then I think one of the main goals for this Russian Zaporizhzhia offensive, the small one, would be taking something like this. If they could take this, this would basically pull up the flank a little bit to be able to start, putting the squeeze on Galiapulia's flank. But right now, they just have to take Malinivka. I don't know how much, this. I don't think this is obviously a main Russian push, but I do think the Russians have accumulated forces to at least put pressure here. If they just take Malinivka, again, it would be kind of like the small Russian offensive that took on the western part of Orekov, where they took Pitahavki, Mala Sherbaki, Stepova, Sherbaki, where they made some, they improved their positions here, but it ultimately was just a small tactical victory. So taking Malinivka could just be a small tactical victory, and then it kind of stops. Alrighty. Now we are going to go to the Pokrovsk direction. And in the Pokrovsk direction, there's been some interesting changes here as well. Mostly in this area near Novopoltovka here. The biggest thing is that we have GLK confirmation of the Russians taking the village of Gorovko, this village right here. This was the last village for the Ukrainians in the Donetsk Oblast. Along with this, we have continuously have sources showing the Russians basically being in the fields in the Dnipro Oblast in the northern part of Gorovka here. And so we see that the Russians are now basically, all they have to do is cross these fields into Novopoltovka, but I think instead of attacking directly, they need to pull up their flanks here. This is why the Russians are battling for the villages of Novomykolaiv and Murovka, because they want to advance along this river to reach the northern part of Novopoltovka. Obviously, the Russians are advancing in the south here. They need to take Dachna. If they could take Zaporizhzhia, Yalta, and Zerka, the Russians would have have enough improvements to move along the river until they reach the village of Filia and reach the Zolona River. That's right here. And then once they reach the village of Filia, they could then, move to the southern part of Novopoltovka. So there's a bunch of moving parts for the Battle of Novopoltovka. But right now, the Russians are slowly but surely reaching it. So taking Gorovka is kind of like the last village the Russians had to take to improve their center positioning here. But I do think the Russians are going to continue pushing north until they pull up their flanks here. But speaking of the northern part, we actually have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in the center part of Novomykolaievka. It depends on, apparently some of these kind of warehouses to the west of this village have not been taken yet. So, maybe we can't say this village has been taken quite yet. But we do know that a lot of this residential area has been taken by the Russians. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians do take the rest of Novomykolaievka and then start battling for the village of Murovka. The biggest problem is that, as the Russians keep pushing this way, the Ukrainians still have a bunch of positions in the Dnipro Oblast in these fields. And so, if the Russians want to, take Murovka, Novomykolaievka, and move here, the Russians will have their flanks extremely exposed to Ukrainian counterattacks, which will be a very big pain in the ass. So, this is probably why the battle for Uspenivka took so long, because once they reached Uspenivka, the Ukrainians were still near Dachna, and, they weren't able to, they kept counterattacking the Russians. So this might be the fate of the Russians trying to take Murovka and Novomykolaievka, because, there's no, the only reason why they were able to take Uspenivka is because the Russians took a bunch of these fields and took Novosibirivka, and that's why they were able to take these two villages of Uspenivka and Novoalexandrivka. But as the Russians reached these villages, now they're out of reach again. So the only way the Russians would be able to support their offensive here is to probably take Udachna, the village of Novopitonoronit, this giant blabber alphabet soup name village, and just kind of try to take these fields in the Dnipro Oblast, and then that'll protect them to be able to go into Novopoltovka. But that would pull a lot of forces from being able to encircle Pokrovsk. But it looks like right now they're kind of stuck here, so we shall see. And yeah, so the Russians, making some decent progress in the center here. They've also cleared up, I think we mentioned this last week, a lot of these areas to the west of Bogdanovka. I do think with the capture of these trenches to the north of Alexivka, the Russians will take the rest of these fields as well, and the Ukrainians will fall back to Dachna. And they have a bunch of trench networks here just to defend Dnipro Oblast. But I do think this kind of these trenches to the south here will be cleared. And we shall see how the Russians continue advancing towards Novopoltovka. But towards Pokrovsk itself, there's been some small changes. In the west here, nothing's changed. Oh, the only big change is that apparently the eastern part of Udachna is now back under Russian control, according to most mappers. I have no clue why the Russians aren't trying to take Udachna. I do think they have, now that they've taken Novosibirivka, they have positions in this area here to be able to assault Udachna directly. But maybe the Ukrainians have fortified this very hard, very hardy. So, but I do think the Russian apparently most mappers show that the Russians are back in Udach, at least the eastern part, especially in this kind of industrial zone, which is kind of like the main base of operations. But the main thing is the Russians have to take this train station, which is a very big, hunky train station, especially for a small town like Udachna, because they have to transport a lot of coal or like metals from this factory here. So that is this is why the train station is like the main base for the Ukrainians here, and the Russians have to take it in order to actually secure Udachna. But the Russians are back in it, but we shall see if the Russians can take Udachna. And then kind of more in the, and there's been no really much changes in the more western part of Pokrovsk. In the more eastern part of Pokrovsk, kind of more in the Minograd direction, we have some changes as well. We do have GLK confirmation that the Russians are in the most, kind of this area between Malinivka and Myrnia. We still don't have confirmation the Russians have taken Myrnia, which is kind of surprising. I thought the Russians would have taken Myrnia by now. It's like a one-way street village. There's a bunch of ways, the Ukrainians don't really have good supply situations here. They probably want to fall back to more better secure positions in Novokonomnichi here. But taking Myrnia is definitely a Russian goal because along with this, one of the biggest gains of the Russians in this Minograd direction is that they have completely captured the village of Kopachi here. And so, and also they have improved their positions to the north of Shintenko-Pershi, taking this area right here. I think maybe they took this last week. I'm not sure. But definitely, they're trying to improve their positions in the north here. And but I do think if they want to continue pushing this way, I do think taking Myrnia and just taking a lot of these fields here would make the Russians have a more solid flank here. And so yeah, Kopachi has fallen. I would guess Myrnia is going to fall soon. If they could take something like this, this would improve their offensive on the eastern part of Minograd very well. But besides that, there's not been much. But it's kind of surprising they have not taken Myrnia yet. But they have taken Kopachi, so that is a good gain for the Russians. So we shall see. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and there's been a bit of a slowdown in operations here. There hasn't been as much progress as in previous weeks, but there's been some progress. And mostly is that the Russians are now fully battling for the villages of Alexandria Kelenovo, Yablunovka, and are now closing in here. The Russians took the Zoria pocket, but now they are completely reaching these villages up north here. And so the reason for this is that actually we had JLK confirmation of the Russians entering the village of Alexandria Kelenovo in the southern part here. Most sources are saying that they got destroyed, so they don't have like a solid positioning here. But this most mappers does show that the Russians have advanced north from Zoria and east from Romanovka and have taken these fields here. So these fields were taken by the Russians. So they're right on the outskirts of Alexandria Kelenovo. The Russians are getting closer and closer to the village of Katerinivka. I do think that within the next maybe week or so, the Russian, there's this like a little river here that splits it, but the Russians could take this kind of one street village in Alexandria Kelenovo. The main defenses are in this area, which is on the other side. But I do think at least part of Alexandria Kelenovo can be taken by the Russians, and this actually would bring the most strategic goals here, because they could actually cut this highway here and reach Kelvin, Bilka, and Katerinivka here. So this kind of supplies them here. The Ukrainians still could support them here, but this would definitely cut the base of support between the Ukrainians defending here and the Ukrainians defending here. I do think the Russians will continue moving along this reservoir just to defend themselves a little bit better, and just try to reach Katerinivka. So they're getting closer and closer there. The battle for Yablunovka is getting the Russians, as I mentioned, took the western part of the village last week, but now the battle's for the center of the village. But however, the reason why it's taking so long is because the Ukrainians have a bunch of trenches here, and the Russians kind of it's hard for the Russians to trench hop. They took all the trenches they could on the more western part, but if they want to continue advancing towards the center of Yablunovka, the Ukrainians will have a bunch of trenches to be able to attack them, and the Russians, you're like, well, why don't they take the trenches? Well, then if they take the trenches, the Ukrainians still have a bunch of positions here, have all these roads where they can attack the Russians trying to attack the trenches. So this is a very hard nut to crack for the Russians. I do think what the Russians have to do is break through into Alexandria Kelenovo from the west here, and just keep moving through these fields here and just attack it, you know, not just continue attacking from the west, but attacking from the south here, and just take everything to the south of this village, or from the south of this river. And that'll probably how the Russians actually crack these villages. And then from here, they could then move along this water reservoir to try to take Keblinbilka and Katerinivka, which will then encircle the Ukrainians in Novospatsky and Sherabrinka, which will then finally end the battle for Toretsk, because the Ukrainians being in these villages allowed them to continue doing attacks into Toretsk. They haven't done any attacks into Toretsk, but it prevents the Russians from being able to fully secure Toretsk, if that makes sense. Just as, for example, the Russians in Chasiv Yar, they might have been able to take the center part of Chasiv Yar, even though we haven't even had any flag raises yet, so I'm still waiting for that. But you know, they have to take a bunch of these areas around it in order to actually fully secure it. You can't just take the village. You have to actually take like the heights and the tactical positions around it to actually fully secure it. But in the kind of more Toretsk area, specifically, kind of more in this area, is we're actually having a lot more progress. The Russians are actually trying to close this gap between the Chasiv Yar area and the Toretsk, which, is, again, I combined into the Konstantinovka direction, so they're both part of the same area. And the Russians are making some very solid progress. They have actually captured more of these trenches. There is a solid, if you look south here, if you kind of zoom in here, you can see there's a bunch of trenches here that the Russians actually took, and we actually had GLK confirmation of the Russians actually clearing these trenches here. So the Russians are, you know, moving along these fields here and clearing these trenches. We also see the Russians clearing these trenches that are on the other side of this canal, which the Ukrainians built. Because this week we have the Russians taking these fields here. So everything to the west from Kudrunivka south has been taken. This kind of is in tandem with the Russians battling for the village of Dolinivka. We don't have 100% confirmation they have completely taken it yet. Last week we saw them in the center of the village, but we don't have confirmation that they're there just yet. But it does show that the Russians are slowly but surely reaching the village of Bilohora and Alexandra Shutina, which are the main goals for the Russian offensive. And if the Russians could reach Bilohor and Alexander Shutina, then they could basically wipe out the rest of the Ukrainians on the other side of this canal, and then link up with the Chasiv Yar direction, and you know, then push towards Konstantinovka. So a lot of you know, small progress here with the Russians, you know, slowly but surely moving towards Bilohora, and you know, clearing out these fields to the north here. This also will help the Russians for that when the Russians start battling for Kilimin-Balkan and Katerinivka. You know, the Russians could have taken a bunch of these fields already, and then, you know, start attacking and trying to clear these trenches here, and then attack Kilimin-Balkan and Katerinivka from multiple angles to take them. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty. Next, and then in Chasiv Yar, there's in the kind of this is also part of the Konstantinovka direction, is that the Russians have there's been the Russians are still battling for this. There's two micro districts, this micro district and this micro district. The Russians have presence in both, but they have not captured them just yet. We do have GLK confirmation of the Russians still being in this northern part here, so that's good for the Russians. We saw the Russians bombing Ukrainian positions in this forest. That's probably why they can't really raise any flags here, because the Ukrainians could use sabotage units to like maybe enter here with like 5 or 6 people and then kind of say they still own it. So the Russians probably have to clear this forest. In order to clear this forest, they have to take the rest of this kind of micro district and then link up with the units that are in this northern micro district and then clear out this forest. And then also taking this small micro district, it has some solid buildings that the Russians have used as a forward operating base. But they're still battling here. There's been no really big changes here. But when there has been map changes is in the northern part here. We talked about how the Russians took this quarry last week. And then this week we have GLK confirmation of the Russians taking the rest of the southern reaching this canal here. And so, you know, I talked about how the Russians have to take Gorivka in order to secure their northern flank here. And it looks like they're continuously doing that. I think next the Russians will take this northern part, this northern canal to the north of Gorivka, and probably take the rest of these fields between the quarry and Gorivka. But the northern flank of Chasiv Yar is pretty much secure. They just have to take a few more little pieces to secure it. And yeah. Alrighty, that is the Konstantinovka direction. Now we are going to go to the Seversk direction, and there's been some small changes in the Seversk direction. The biggest kind of news is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Gorivka. And the reason why they've been able to do this, unlike last time, is because the Russians have actually finally taken. I think they took more of these these hills this week. and we have the Russians raising the flags in the most western part of Gorivka. But the reason why they were actually able to do this, unlike last time, is because instead of doing suicide charges for fame, they were able to take the dominant heights that are in this area, and I think everything up to here. So I think most sources are saying that the Russians have taken the rest of these hills. Maybe maybe the Ukrainians are still in the most western part of this hill. But in any case, the Russians have taken the vast majority of the hill here, and being able to do that, the Russians actually been able to secure themselves in Gorivka, which is on the lowlands here. So yeah, it's that's why they were able to take Gorivka. So, very good gain for the Russians. Now the main goal for the Russians is to continue pushing along these fields here. Probably try to take these trench networks to the north of Seversk, and just try to start battling for the village of Sherebrenka, which is also razed to the ground, but it's probably one of the main goals for the Russians to take Sherebrenka, these northern trenches, and try to reach the Bakhmutka River here. And from here, if they could reach this river here, then they could encircle Seversk from the north. And then the Russians are also making some small progress in Ivano-Darivka. I do think if they want to take Seversk, they also have to improve their position in the south here. They're doing a lot of movements in the north here, but not in the south, but we shall see. But they have made some small progress here in the south this week. This week, they've taken some fields to the north of Ivano-Darivka, which is good. Again, in order to take Verkhomanivka and Ivano-Darivka, they have to take these hills that are in the middle here. And, we actually could see this here. So the Ukrainians built a bunch of trenches here that prevent the Russians from taking Ivano-Darivka. But, now that they're clearing these trenches, they're able to then, if they continue pushing up to here, for example, then they could secure themselves here, and this would give them a launching position to start encircling Seversk from the south. So as you can see, the main thing in the Seversk direction is to try to take these hills here to be able to actually push themselves to give them a forward operating position to encircle Seversk from the south and north, and then from there, the battle for Seversk will begin. There's been no changes in the Liman direction, surprisingly. I thought there'd be some changes, but there's been not. But there's been some small changes in the Kupyansk direction. In the Kupyansk direction, in the small changes, there's finally been some movement in kind of the more eastern bank of the Oskol River near Kupyansk instead. Most sources are saying the Russians have completely captured the village of Sapelvo-Novoselivka and have captured some some fields to the north of it and some small fields to the south of it. So that makes sense. The Ukrainians, this village probably got razed to the ground from mutual shelling, and the Ukrainians don't have really good positions here. They probably have some artificial trenches and whatnot, but the main defense for the Ukrainians are in this area here near the Kupyansk suburbs here. So, the Russians probably exploited the Ukrainians probably sending a bunch of troops from the eastern part of here, probably up north here, to because this was where all the battles were going on, and the Russians were able to exploit it and maybe finally secure themselves in Sapelvo-Novoselivka. So, that's some small gain for the Russians. One small gain for the Ukrainians is that we actually have geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians being in this trench network here. This definitely puts a very big buzz, kind of bit of a thorn in the Russian offense in Lazova and what the fuck? How do you pronounce this? Zaporizhzhia here, trying to push south here. If the Ukrainians are here, then the Ukrainians definitely could put a lot of pressure in these two villages, and definitely push the Russians back here. The main thing for the Russians, they have to keep this little bridge, this salient they have here, because this splits the Kupyansk and Liman directions, and this is something that puts a very big thorn in the Ukrainian side here. So, the Russian offensive here is going to, the Ukrainians could definitely put the squeeze on the flanks here. So it looks like they're doing that. So they took this tree line here, or maybe they already took it. But this definitely puts pressure on Lazova and Zaporizhzhia here. So we shall see if the Russians could hold on here. And then kind of more north here in the kind of the Oskol bridge here, we finally have more geolocate confirmation of the Russian. This map has already been covered with this, because I think we had it before, but we have more geolocate confirmation of the Russians being kind of near Krash and Pershi. So we just know the Russians are still here, just for more confirmation. And then some map changes shows that the Russians kind of pushed west of Dorishnia, took some more of these areas to the west of it, but nothing big. But yeah, the Russians are kind of a little bit, are still moving here, but not as much. Yeah. Now let us go to the Sumy direction, because there's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. in the Sumy direction, there's actually been some interesting changes. The Russians are, again, like in Kostiantynivka, aren't making as much progress here as they did in late May, but there's definitely been a lot of interesting things happening here. This week, the main thing is that we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians completely capturing the village of Lyubunivka and Vorachny here. These are one of the two last villages here. And the Russians are continuously pushing south from these villages and have taken more of these fields to the west of Yunakivka, which is the main Ukrainian defense here. The Russians have also taken more and more of these forests near Satki. We have most sources are saying they took more of these villages. Last week they took these kind of northern forests. Now they took these more southern forests here. And I wouldn't be surprised if within a week or two they take the rest of these forests and take the village of Satki. And from here, this basically spells doom for the Ukrainian defenses in Yunakivka here. Most sources, we don't have any geolocated confirmation of this, but most sources are saying that the Russians are now battling for the center of Yunakivka here. This definitely is a big, if the Russians are in the center of Yunakivka, this is game, set, match for the Ukrainians because I thought the Russians were still in the northern part and the Ukrainians were holding them off. Now, that being said, we don't have any geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the center of Yunakivka yet, just map changes, but we shall see. It looks like the Russians also stopped moving toward the village of Kotina and Piraski and Novokorachki here. The Russians are bombing this. There's been a lot more bombing videos here, but this is the second Ukrainian defense line, but we don't actually have the Russians reaching here anymore. But there's been map changes more in this western direction here. So if the Russians could take Saki and Yunakivka, the Russians will have a very strong, how do you say it, border zone here, and that could be maybe they stop, maybe once they take Yunakivka they stop, but I do think it might have been more good for the Russians to take the second line of defense here, take something like this, and then then they could put their drone teams here and artillery systems here, and then they actually will be in range of Sumy. Right now, if they stop here, they won't be in range of Sumy. But if they take the second line of defense and put their drones and artillery systems here, they actually would be within artillery and drone range of Sumy itself, and they could basically put a lot of pressure on the city. So I do think the Russians will try to push towards the second line of defense, but then I think from there they'll stop. That's my guess. And then also kind of more in this area, we actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being right on the northern outskirts of Myropolya in this area right here. So that does make sense. I have always said that the Russians could try to squeeze this pimple here. The Russians have surrounded this on multiple angles. And Myropolya is a very big town. I think it's a town of 3,000 people, 2,000 people. It's a very big town. And I think the Ukrainians have fortified it a lot, but we do have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being right on the outskirts of it in the north here. So definitely this means that the village of Alexandrivka has been taken. I don't think if it's even it's one of those towns that's a town in name. Yeah, as you can see, if you look down, there's nothing here. But in any case, it looks like the Russians are going to try to maybe make a foothold in Myropolya. So yeah, and then also it looks like the Russians are holding on to Techno here, and basically the Ukrainians have not been able to squeeze the Russians out of this village just yet, or town, I should say. It's a pretty big town. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. I know there's the Iran-Israel war going on, but I have no clue what's going on there, so I have nothing to say there. My focus has been on the Russian-Ukraine war. So yeah, if you want to continue seeing these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.